The advertisement nailed to the post office board in Caldwell, Kansas read simply, "Wanted, a capable woman of good character to care for 2 young boys on a cattle ranch. Room, board, and fair wages provided. Inquire at the Barnett Ranch, 12 miles east of town." And when Olive Wallace read it for the third time on that bitter January morning in 1882, she told herself it was nothing more than a practical arrangement, a way to survive the winter and perhaps save enough money to start over somewhere new. She told herself she did not care who the man was, or what sorrow had carved the words so economically onto that yellowed paper. She told herself a great many things that January morning, and nearly every one of them turned out to be wrong. Olive was 24 years old and had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks prior on the back of a freight wagon after leaving her aunt's house in Wichita under circumstances she preferred not to discuss in detail. She had 42 cents, a carpetbag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a Bible, and a small daguerreotype of her mother, who had passed the previous spring. The world had narrowed itself down to something very small and very cold, and the advertisement felt like a door opening in a wall she had believed to be solid. She asked the postmaster, a wide man named Gerald Finch who smelled of pipe tobacco and disapproval, about the Barnett Ranch. "Chester Barnett's place," Gerald said, not looking up from his sorting. "Good land, fair man, lost his wife 2 years back to fever. He's got 2 boys, 7 and 5, I think. Hard time of it out there, just him and those little ones and a handful of ranch hands. Is he a respectable man?" Olive asked, because she had learned the hard way that respectability was not something to be assumed. Gerald did look up then, studying her with the measuring eyes of a man accustomed to judging strangers. "Chester Barnett is one of the most respected men in this county, miss." "You be safe there," he paused. "You any good with children?" "I raised my 2 younger brothers from the time I was 14, she said. "I'm good with children." She borrowed paper and ink from the hotel where she had been spending her dwindling coins on a shared room, and she wrote a letter that evening by lamplight. She described her experience honestly, her age, her health, her character. She mentioned her brothers. She did not mention Wichita or the circumstances of her departure. She posted the letter the following morning, and spent the next 4 days trying not to think about it, while she took in mending work from the women at the church to keep herself fed. On the 5th day a reply came. It was brief, written in a firm, slightly angular hand that suggested a man who was more comfortable holding a rope than a pen, though he clearly knew how to use both. "Miss Wallace, your letter was satisfactory. If you are willing, I can send my foreman to collect you on Saturday morning. The boys' names are Samuel and Henry. Samuel is 7 and is serious-minded. Henry is 5 and is not. Wages will be $12 per month. The room is small but clean. I hope you will find the arrangement agreeable. C. Barnett." Olive read it twice and felt something she had not felt in a long while. Not excitement precisely, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like the possibility of solid ground. Saturday came cold and clear, and the foreman turned out to be a bow-legged Mexican man named Rodrigo Cruz, who had been with Chester Barnett for 7 years, and who spoke to Olive with a courtesy that put her at ease almost immediately. He helped her carpetbag into the wagon bed as though it were made of something precious, which it was not, and they set out east across the flat brown Kansas plain. "The boys are good boys," Rodrigo said after a while, which Olive took to mean he knew she was nervous and was trying to help. "Samuel, he is serious. Henry, he is a tornado in boots. You will see. And their father?" Olive asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Rodrigo considered this for a long moment. "Chester Barnett is a man who works very hard and feels very much and shows very little of either," he said at last. "He has been lonely since Eleanor passed. Not just for a woman, you understand, but for something whole in the house." He glanced at her sideways. "He did not tell me to say that. I say it because it is true and because I am old enough not to care about being too direct." Olive did not respond to that. She watched the prairie pass and thought about what it meant for a house to feel whole. The Barnett Ranch announced itself first as a windbreak of cottonwoods, then as the dark shapes of a barn and outbuildings, and finally as a wide, low-slung house with a front porch that ran the full length of the structure. It was solidly built, weathered but well-maintained, and there were two small boys standing on that porch in the gray winter morning, watching the wagon approach with the focused intensity that children reserve for events they have been anticipating for days. Samuel stood very straight and kept his hands at his sides. Henry was gripping the porch railing and leaning forward over it at an angle that suggested either fearlessness or a complete indifference to consequences. And behind them in the doorway stood Chester Barnett. Olive's first impression of him was simply tall. Her second impression, as the wagon drew closer, was more complicated. He was perhaps 31 or 32, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with the kind of face that the Kansas sun had worked on honestly, adding lines at the corners of eyes that were a very particular shade of gray-green. He had not bothered to put on a hat, and the wind was pushing at his hair, and he was watching her approach with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not unfriendly, not welcoming either, exactly. More as if he was bracing himself for something he could not entirely predict. Rodrigo pulled the wagon to a stop and Chester came down the porch steps. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat over his flannel shirt and his boots were already muddy from the morning chores. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked up at Olive and said, "Miss Wallace, I'm Chester Barnett. Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the offer," she said, and he helped her down from the wagon with one hand, briefly, as if he was aware of the propriety of it and careful to perform exactly the right amount of it, no more. "Boys, come down here," he called, and Samuel came down the steps at a measured pace, and Henry came down them in 3 leaping bounds and crashed into the yard. "I am Samuel," Samuel announced, extending his hand with a solemnity that made Olive want to smile very much. He was dark like his father, with the same gray-green eyes and a grave, watchful quality about him. "I am very pleased to meet you, Samuel," she said, shaking his hand with equal solemnity. Henry did not extend his hand. He looked up at her with enormous brown eyes that she supposed he had gotten from his mother, and said, "Are you going to make us wash behind our ears every single night?" "Henry," Chester said, the single word carrying an entire lecture's worth of content. "I will make you wash behind your ears as often as they require it," Olive told Henry, "which based on what I can see right now appears to be immediately." Henry touched his ear, discovered the mud there as if for the first time and looked at his father accusingly. Chester's mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was certainly related to one. "Come inside," Chester said. "Rodrigo will bring your bag. We can talk about the arrangements." The house was larger inside than it appeared, with a main room that served as both parlor and dining area, a kitchen off the back, and a staircase leading up to the sleeping quarters. It was not a woman's house. That was apparent immediately, not in a slovenly way, but in the way of a space that had been maintained carefully by people who were focused entirely on function. There were no curtains on the windows. There was a wool blanket folded on the back of the settle, a very good rifle hung above the fireplace, a stack of seed catalogs, and a copy of the Caldwell Post on the table. There was a child's sock on the floor under the table that no one had retrieved. The kitchen smelled of coffee and something burnt. "We have been managing," Chester said, following her gaze around the room with an expression that suggested he was seeing it through her eyes and finding it somewhat lacking. "You have been managing very well," she said, which was partly true and partly kindness, and he seemed to understand the proportion because he almost smiled again. He offered her coffee at the kitchen table, and they sat across from each other while the boys hovered in the doorway like small satellites, and Chester explained what he needed. The cooking, the laundry, the cleaning, the oversight of the boys during the days when he and the hands were out working. Samuel attended school in town 3 days a week, and Rodrigo drove him in. Henry was too young yet. Chester wanted them taught their letters and numbers at home regardless. "I want them to have what they need," Chester said, choosing his words with visible care. Their mother was a capable woman, and she kept a good home, and she was patient with them. Since she passed, things have been lacking in ways that I am not able to address and continue running the ranch. I understand, Olive said. I don't want them to feel that lack, he said. I've done my best, but a man's best in this particular area is not always sufficient. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it slightly in his hands, and Olive realized that this admission had cost him something. I will do my best to fill that lack, she said quietly. Chester looked up then, and for just a moment the careful, braced expression was gone, and what was underneath it was something much simpler and more vulnerable, something that looked like a man who had been carrying a great deal of weight for a very long time and had just been told, perhaps, that he might be allowed to set some of it down. Good, he said. That's all I'm asking. Her room was small and clean as advertised. It was at the end of the upstairs hall, with a window that looked out over the eastern pasture where the Flint Hills rolled away toward the horizon in waves of dormant brown grass. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a dresser, and a hook on the back of the door. Someone, she suspected Samuel from the seriousness of the execution, had placed a small vase with dried prairie flowers on the dresser. She stood at the window for a moment after Rodrigo had deposited her carpetbag and left, looking out at that wide winter sky, and she felt something she had not felt in months, a sense that she was in the right place. She did not examine the feeling too closely. She simply noted it and began to unpack. The first week was an exercise in learning. Olive learned the layout of the kitchen, the temperament of the stove, which burner ran hot and which ran unpredictable. She learned that Samuel liked his oatmeal with no sweetening and his eggs soft, and that Henry liked everything sweet and ate almost nothing that was green. She learned that the laundry well was around the back of the house, that the hens laid in the south corner of the coop, and that Chester Barnett was out of the house by 5 in the morning and rarely in before 6 in the evening. She learned that he was unfailingly courteous at the dinner table and said almost nothing of a personal nature whatsoever. She learned that he watched her when he thought she was not watching him. She did not address this. She served supper and helped Henry with the butter on his bread and asked Samuel about his day at school, and she was careful and professional and appropriate in all things, because that was the arrangement and she understood the arrangement. But she noticed. It was Henry who broke through her composure first, because Henry broke through everything. On her 8th day at the ranch, she was washing the breakfast dishes when she heard a tremendous crash from the direction of the parlor, followed by a silence that was somehow more alarming than the crash itself. She found Henry sitting in the middle of the parlor floor, surrounded by the shattered remains of a ceramic lamp, looking not frightened but deeply philosophical about the whole situation. "It fell," Henry said. "I see that," Olive said, crouching down to look at him for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at the pieces of the lamp. "My mother brought that lamp from St. Louis," Olive stilled. She looked at the fragments on the floor, the painted roses on white ceramic now in 7 pieces, and she understood why the silence after the crash had been so absolute. Henry, at 5, had understood immediately what he had done. "I'm sorry," Henry said, and his voice was very small. "I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't," she said. She sat down on the floor beside him, which was not a dignified thing to do but was clearly the right thing to do, and she picked up one of the larger fragments and held it carefully. "Tell me about your mother." Henry looked at her with those large brown eyes, and she could see him deciding something. "She smelled like lavender," he said finally. "And she could whistle really loud. Pa says she could whistle louder than any man he ever knew, and he was always proud of it." He picked up a fragment. "Her name was Eleanor." "She sounds wonderful," Olive said. "She was the best," Henry said with complete conviction. Then, after a moment, in a smaller voice, "Do you know how to whistle?" Olive could, in fact, whistle. Her father had taught her. She pursed her lips and produced a clear, clean whistle that rang through the quiet house, and Henry's face broke into a wide, brilliant smile that rearranged everything in it. "That's pretty good," he allowed. She swept up the ceramic pieces and placed them in a small box, which she set on the shelf rather than throwing away, because she sensed that Chester Barnett would want to know what had happened and to have the pieces, even broken. She was right. That evening at supper she told him plainly what had occurred, that Henry had been climbing on the settle and the lamp had fallen, that Henry was unhurt, and that she had saved the pieces in the box on the shelf. Chester looked at the box for a long moment. Something moved in his face that he controlled quickly. "Thank you," he said, "for saving them." "Of course," she said. He retrieved the box after the boys were in bed. She was still in the kitchen heating milk for the following morning's pudding, and she heard him move through the parlor and then the sound of him sitting down, and then nothing for a long while. She kept her attention on her work and gave him his privacy, which was the only kind thing she knew to do. When he came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, his expression was the usual composed one, but his eyes were slightly red at the edges. "Good night, Miss Wallace," he said. "Good night, Mr. Barnett," she said. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. "The pudding smells good," he said, and then he went upstairs. February arrived with a week of hard weather, a blizzard that kept everyone inside for 4 days, and tested the limits of everybody's patience and companionship in equal measure. Rodrigo and the 2 other ranch hands, a pair of brothers named Pete and Cullen Marsh, took refuge in the bunkhouse, and the main house became an island of lamplight and close quarters. Olive discovered on the second day of the blizzard that Chester Barnett played chess. She had found the board in the bottom of a cabinet while looking for a pot, and he had seen her looking at it and said, with what seemed like genuine surprise, "Do you play?" "My father taught me," she said. "I'm not very good." "I'll teach you the parts you don't know," he said. They played chess that evening after the boys were asleep, by the firelight, while the wind drove the snow against the window glass and made the lamp flames lean. He was methodical and patient as a teacher, explaining the logic of each move without condescension, and she found that she was not as poor a player as she had claimed. She caught him off guard twice, and he responded each time with a slight narrowing of those gray-green eyes that she was beginning to read as the chess-playing equivalent of genuine respect. "Where did you grow up?" he asked, studying the board. "Indiana," she said. "A small town near Indianapolis." "My father was a school teacher." "Is that where you learned to handle children?" "My father was good with children," she said, "and I had 2 younger brothers and we lost our mother when I was 14, so there was a need. She moved a pawn." "What about you?" "Texas, originally. I came up on the cattle drives in 73 and 74 and found the grass up here too good to leave. Bought this land in 76. He moved his bishop and she realized she had not seen that coming." Eleanor was from Caldwell. Her family homesteaded just to the north. "We married in 74. He said Eleanor's name with an ease that told her it was something he had worked at, the ability to say it without stopping. The loss was clearly still there, evident in the way his voice shifted almost imperceptibly when he spoke of her, but he was not consumed by it. He was a man who had grieved and was continuing to grieve, quietly on his own time. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Olive said. "She was," he said simply. "She would have liked you, I think." He looked up from the board briefly and caught her eye and then looked back down. "That came out perhaps more personally than I intended." "I didn't mind it," Olive said. The blizzard ended on day 4 and the world was white and still and blindingly bright. The boys escaped into it like animals released from a pen, and Henry immediately fell face first into a drift, which turned out to be exactly what he had intended. Olive stood on the porch with her shawl and watched Chester show Samuel how to check the cattle for signs of cold injury, moving through the white pasture in his heavy coat, Samuel trotting seriously alongside him, asking questions she could not hear from this distance but which Chester answered patiently, one by one. She was not supposed to find that particular scene affecting, but she did. By March the routine had settled into something that felt, unexpectedly, like permanence. Olive had learned the rhythms of the ranch the way you learn a piece of music, when to expect the accelerations and when the quiet passages, and she had found her place within them. She baked bread on Mondays. She drove Henry into Caldwell on Wednesdays for the children's story hour at the church, which Henry attended with theatrical reluctance and secret enthusiasm. She taught both boys their letters in the afternoons, Samuel expanding rapidly on what he knew, Henry treating the alphabet as an adversary to be negotiated with rather than conquered. And she played chess with Chester Barnett on the evenings when the weather kept them inside, which in Kansas in early spring was frequent. She was also beginning to understand what Rodrigo had meant when he said Chester felt much and showed little. It was not that Chester was cold. It was that he was careful. He had built a perimeter around himself that was not hostile but was very solid, and he maintained it with discipline. But she was beginning to see the edges of what was inside it. The way he remembered, without being told, that she took her coffee with more milk than most people considered reasonable, and he made sure the milk was warm before she added it. The way he had, without comment, hung curtains in her bedroom window one morning while she was driving Henry into town, curtains made from a blue calico that happened to be almost exactly the color of the dress she wore on Sundays, which meant he had noticed the color of her Sunday dress. The way he looked at her sometimes across the dinner table when the boys were arguing about something, and the lamplight was catching in her dark hair, and the look on his face during those moments was one she was increasingly unable to pretend she did not recognize. It was on a Tuesday in late March that things shifted, and it happened not dramatically, but in the simple, private way that real things tend to happen. She had spent the morning making apple butter from the last of the stored apples, a long and hot process that left the kitchen steaming and fragrant, and she had just settled at the kitchen table for a moment of rest when Chester came in unexpectedly early, around noon, because one of the horses had thrown a shoe and needed to wait for the farrier who wasn't coming until the following day. He found her at the kitchen table with her hair somewhat escaped from its pins, and her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove and her eyes closed for just a moment. He must have come in very quietly because she did not hear him, and when she opened her eyes he was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, and an expression on his face that he had not had time to prepare. It was a completely unguarded expression, open and soft and wanting, in the most straightforward possible way. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them moved for the space of 3 full seconds. Then he cleared his throat and looked at his hat. "I apologize for coming in early." "Storm threw a shoe." "Tornado," she said, meaning the horse because his best horse was named Tornado on account of an incident in his first year that Rodrigo had described to her at length. "Tornado," he confirmed. He hung his hat on the hook by the door, a thing he only did when he was staying inside for a while. "Is there coffee?" "There is," she said. "Sit down, I'll get it." He sat at the kitchen table while she poured his coffee, and she set it in front of him with the warm milk already added, and she sat down across from him, and he did not look at his coffee for a moment. He looked at her. "Miss Wallace," he said, and then stopped. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who has several things to say and is trying to choose among them and not being very successful. "Are you content here?" he asked at last, which was clearly not the first thing he had considered saying. She considered the question honestly. "I am more content here than I have been anywhere in some time," she said. "The boys are wonderful, the work is meaningful, the house is good." She paused. "I am content." "Good," he said. He looked at his coffee. "I am glad of it." Another silence, less uncomfortable than most silences between them. "The apple butter smells fine," he said. "It will be ready tomorrow," she said. "I was going to make a batch of biscuits this afternoon so we'd have something to put it on." "Henry will eat himself sick on it," Chester said, and there was a warm light in his voice that only ever appeared when he spoke of his sons. "He absolutely will," she agreed. "And I will feel terrible and you will feel terrible and Henry will feel very smug about the whole thing." Chester laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, without any reservation, and it transformed him. The careful, composed face opened up into something entirely different, warm and a little boyish and completely disarming, and Olive felt the effect of it somewhere in her chest in a way she had been trying to avoid for several weeks. "That is a completely accurate prediction," he said. They drank their coffee, and the kitchen was warm and the apple butter bubbled gently on the stove, and outside the March wind moved through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, one of the hands was singing something indistinct and pleasant. And Olive thought that she would be very happy to sit in this kitchen and drink coffee with this man for a very long time. And then she thought that this was precisely the kind of thinking that was going to make her situation complicated. And then she thought that it might already be complicated, and that it might have been complicated since approximately the moment she stepped off the wagon and looked up at him standing in his doorway. That evening at supper, Henry announced with complete seriousness that he wanted Olive to come to his birthday. "Your birthday is in July," Chester said. "I know," Henry said. "I want to tell her now so she doesn't make other plans." Olive pressed her lips together. "I will make sure to keep July clear," she said. "You should probably just stay forever," Henry said, serving himself what was approximately 4 times his reasonable allotment of potatoes. "It's easier." There was a silence at the table that had a very particular texture to it. Chester said carefully, "Miss Wallace's arrangements are her own business, Henry." "I know," Henry said, apparently unconcerned. "I'm just saying it makes sense." Samuel, who had been attending to this exchange from under his dark lashes with the expression of someone taking notes, said nothing. Samuel had become, over the past months, Olive's most attentive student and her most thoughtful companion, and she suspected that Samuel had noticed a great many things about the situation that he was keeping careful account of. Olive changed the subject to the arithmetic problem she had given Samuel that afternoon, and the moment passed. But the weight of Henry's simple declaration stayed in the room like a thing you had walked through that left a mark on you. She did not sleep particularly well that night. 2 days later, Rodrigo pulled her aside while she was hanging laundry and told her, in his direct manner, that Chester Barnett had not looked at a woman twice in 2 years since Eleanor passed, and that the ranch hands had a small informal wager among themselves, which he was not confirming or denying, and that Rodrigo personally believed in clear communication among friends. Olive said, "We are not exactly friends, Rodrigo." Rodrigo said, "We are absolutely friends. We have been friends since the first Wednesday when you sent me into town with Henry, and you put a piece of pie in a cloth in my coat pocket without being asked." Olive could not argue with that. "He is a good man," Rodrigo said, "and you are a good woman, and the boys need more than a hired woman, and I think Chester Barnett knows this." Olive hung a shirt on the line and said, "His wife has not been gone very long." 2 years, Rodrigo said, and Eleanor herself told him before she passed that he should not remain alone. She was a practical woman, she loved him, and she was practical. He paused. "I am also being practical." Olive pinned the shirt and said nothing. The event that changed everything happened in April, on a Wednesday when Olive had driven Henry into Caldwell for the story hour, and had made several purchases at the general store: a sack of flour, salt, thread, and a small paper packet of the chamomile tea she had come to depend on in the evenings. She was loading the wagon in front of the store when a man she did not know came out of the saloon across the street and stopped on the boardwalk and stared at her. He was a big man, rough-looking, with a coat that had seen better days and the particular loose energy of someone who had been drinking in the late morning. He crossed the street toward her in a way she did not like, and she kept her attention on the wagon and did not meet his eyes. "You're the widow woman from the Barnett Ranch," he said, stopping too close to her. "I work for the Barnett Ranch," she said evenly. "I'm not a widow." "Nanny, then," he said, with a tone that made the word sound like something else. "Mighty pretty Nanny." "Excuse me," she said, moving to go around him to the wagon seat. He put his hand on the wagon wheel, blocking her path, not touching her but making it clear he could. "I'm Vince Holler," he said. "I had a land dispute with Chester Barnett 2 years back. Just thought it was interesting, him hiring himself a pretty young woman. Man couldn't have hired an old widow if he'd tried. Olive looked at him with a directness she had cultivated over years of dealing with men who confused her composure with vulnerability. "I suggest you get out of my way," she said. He was not accustomed to that tone in the mouth of a slight young woman because it made him blink and step back an automatic half-step. And in that half-step she moved around him and climbed onto the wagon seat with Henry's small hand in hers, and she did not look back. She told Chester about it that evening without drama, stating the facts plainly. She was not frightened. She was irritated, and she thought he should know. Chester's face went through several things in quick succession while she talked. By the time she finished, he was very still and his jaw was set in a way she had not seen before. "Vince Holler," he said. "He mentioned the land dispute." "That was settled 2 years ago in my favor," Chester said. "He's been holding a grudge ever since. He has a habit of making himself unpleasant, but he's never been dangerous exactly." He paused. "I'm sorry he spoke to you that way." "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "That's apparent." He looked at her steadily. "I still don't like it." "Neither do I," she said. "But I wanted you to know." "Good," he said. "Thank you for telling me." His hands were resting on the back of the kitchen chair and his knuckles were slightly white. "If he bothers you again, I want to know immediately." "Understood," she said. Chester came into Caldwell the following Wednesday himself, on the pretext of needing to speak with the land agent, and he accompanied Olive and Henry to the store and back. He did not explain this beyond saying he had business in town, and Olive did not challenge it, and Vince Holler did not appear, and Henry was thrilled to have his father along and made Chester carry every single package. Walking back to the wagon, Henry between them holding both their hands, swinging himself up between them with the particular joy of a 5-year-old who has discovered leverage. Olive looked sideways at Chester and found him already looking at her, and they were both struck at the same moment by the picture they made. The three of them in the April sunshine on the Caldwell boardwalk, and neither of them looked away quite as quickly as they probably should have. "This is a good day," Henry announced, swinging himself up again. "We should do this every Wednesday." Chester said, "We'll see," but he was still looking at Olive when he said it, and there was something in his expression that was no longer very carefully controlled. Spring opened the land and warmed it and brought the ranch to its busiest season. Chester was out from before dawn until after dark most days through the cattle work, the branding, the assessment of the new calves, the endless work of fence lines and water sources and pasture management. Olive barely saw him during those long days, just the shape of him returning in the dusty evenings, and the brief exchanges at supper before he fell asleep in the chair by the fire reading the stock reports, and she covered him with the wool blanket before she went upstairs. A thing that had become so natural she did not even think about it anymore, until one evening Samuel came downstairs for water and found her tucking the blanket around his sleeping father and looked at her with an expression of complete satisfaction, as if something he had predicted had been confirmed. "Good night, Samuel," she said. "Good night, Miss Wallace," he said, very dignified. It was the following Sunday that Chester Barnett sat down next to Olive on the church pew after the service and said, entirely without preamble, "I need to talk to you." He said it quietly, and his tone was not alarming, but it was serious, and she felt her heart begin to beat somewhat faster than usual. They walked out to the churchyard, while Rodrigo kept the boys occupied with some task involving a stick and a fence post that Rodrigo seemed to be inventing as he went along. The April air was warm and the churchyard was quiet, and Chester stood with his hat in his hands and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "I am not good at this," he said, which was the most honest opening statement she had ever heard a person make. "Take your time," she said. He did. He turned his hat in his hands twice. "I hired you as a nanny," he said. "That's what the advertisement said, and that's what I intended. The boys needed someone, and I needed the house to work better, and I thought that was the whole of it." He stopped, turned the hat again. "It isn't the whole of it." Olive did not speak. "Something happened here that I didn't plan for," Chester said. I'm not a man who speaks easily about personal things. I never have been, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I think you deserve to know what I'm feeling, because otherwise things will continue as they are, and things continuing as they are is." He stopped again. "It isn't sufficient. Not anymore." "What are you feeling?" she asked very quietly. He finally looked at her directly. Those gray-green eyes in the full April sunlight were the most honest eyes she had ever looked into. "I care about you, Olive," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, her first name, and the sound of it in his voice did something irreversible to her. "More than an employer cares about a good employee. More than," he exhaled. "I don't have clean language for it. I know that's not much of a declaration, but I have been trying to say it for weeks, and that is the most honest version of it I can manage." She looked at him for a moment, the hat turning in his hands, the careful, solid face with the uncareful eyes. "I care about you too," she said. "More than I expected to, considerably more, and I have been very determinedly not thinking about it." Something released in his posture, almost imperceptible, but she caught it. "Then I am not the only one who has been determinedly not thinking about it." "You are not," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a man who moves quickly," he said. "With Alina, we courted for 18 months. I'm not saying this would take 18 months. I don't know how long it would take, but I want to do this right. I want you to know that my intentions are genuine and that I'm not asking anything of you that isn't given freely." "I know that," she said. "You are one of the most honorable men I have ever known." He blinked as if this surprised him, as if no one had said this to him before, or as if he had not expected her to say it. "Then I'd like to court you," he said, "if you're willing." She thought about the blue curtains on her bedroom window, cut to match her dress. She thought about warm milk in the coffee before she asked. She thought about chess by firelight and Henry in her lap, and Samuel shaking her hand in the January yard, with the solemnity of someone recognizing something important. She thought about a man who saved a broken lamp in a box because it had mattered to his wife, and who covered himself in the chair with the blanket she had put there. "I am willing," she said. The courting of Olive Wallace by Chester Barnett was, like the man himself, deliberate and genuine, and occasionally quite beautiful. It began with a Sunday walk after church, just the two of them, while Rodrigo and the boys stayed behind. Chester was not particularly demonstrative, but he was attentive in the particular way she had come to know, refining it now from the general attentiveness of an employer to the specific attentiveness of a man who was paying very careful attention to a specific woman. He asked her about Indiana and about her father and her brothers, and she told him things she had not told anyone in a long time. About the day her mother died, and how she had held herself together because there was no one else to hold things together, and how afterward she had discovered that the habit of holding yourself together can become so ingrained that it takes a very long time to remember how to let someone else help you hold things. Chester listened to all of this without trying to fix it or minimize it, which was the rarest and most valuable thing. He told her about Alina. Told her honestly, and without the kind of self-conscious loyalty that becomes a wall. He loved Alina, and he would always love Alina, and Alina was gone, and those three things were all simultaneously true, and none of them canceled the others. He told her about the hardest year, the year after, when he had functioned entirely on purpose, and the boys had kept him going because they needed him, and he had been grateful for the needing. "Grief is a strange country," he said. They were sitting on a log at the edge of the cottonwood windbreak, watching the evening light change over the western pasture. "You come out of it and you're in a different place than you went in, but you do come out of it." "You did come out of it," she agreed. He looked at her. "You helped." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad." "I don't know that I could have told you that a few months ago," he said. "I'm telling you now." He held her hand for the first time on the walk back to the house. Just took it simply as if it were the most natural thing, and it was. His hand was large and roughened from the work and warm, and she walked beside him through the long evening grass, and she thought, "Here is where I am. Here is what is real. Here is what matters." Henry's reaction to the new arrangement was to act as if he had personally arranged it, and was very pleased with himself. Samuel's reaction was to be unsurprised, and then, over the following days, to permit himself a smile that he kept trying to suppress and failing. Rodrigo won the wager, which he confirmed to Olive with no particular detail about the amount and considerable satisfaction. It was a May evening when Chester kissed her for the first time, on the porch after the boys were in bed. They had been sitting out there in the warm evening, talking about nothing important, the plan for the summer pasture, whether Henry's reading was progressing or if she needed a different approach, and the conversation had gone quiet in a comfortable way, and she had been watching the stars come out one by one over the Kansas plain, and he had been watching her. When she turned from the stars to look at him, he was very close, closer than she had fully registered, and his eyes asked the question before anything else, and she answered it by being very still, and he kissed her with a gentleness that was entirely in keeping with everything she knew of him, careful and certain and warm. When it ended, she said, a little breathlessly, "That was a very good first kiss." He said, "I've been practicing it in my head for about 6 weeks." She laughed and he smiled, and it was not a restrained smile but a full one, and in the starlight on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, he was the most handsome man she had ever seen in her life. He proposed marriage in June, on a Sunday evening, in the kitchen of all places, because that was the room where the most real conversations of their shared life had taken place, and so it was fitting. He did not go down on one knee, which she had not expected of him, but he stood across the kitchen table and looked at her with an expression that was completely open, all the careful composure set aside deliberately, and he said, "I want you to marry me, not just to take care of the boys, though the boys need a mother and you would be a remarkable one. I want you to marry me because I love you and because I want to build the rest of my life beside you. Those are the reasons in order." She had been drying a dish and she set it down on the counter carefully. "The boys need a mother," she said, repeating his phrase back to him, "and you need more." "Yes," he said, "considerably more." "Specifically you." "Then yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He came around the kitchen table and took her face in both hands and kissed her with considerably more than the first-time gentleness, and it was a very good moment in a kitchen that smelled of bread and summer and the particular warmth of a house that had found its wholeness again. The wedding was in August, at the church in Caldwell, because that was where Eleanor had married him and where Samuel had been baptized, and where Henry had distinguished himself the previous Christmas by tripping over the nativity set and sending the ceramic donkey sliding under 3 pews. It was a plain ceremony and a good one. Olive wore a dress that Chester's sister, who had come up from Texas for the occasion, had helped her make from a cream-colored silk that had been enormously practical to source in Caldwell and worth every difficulty. Chester wore his good coat and had, she noticed with deep affection, taken extraordinary care with his hair. Chester's sister was named Marian Barnett. She was 29, unmarried, sharp-tongued and perceptive, and she pulled Olive aside before the ceremony and said, "I need you to know that my brother has not looked like himself in 2 years, and he has looked like himself every single time I've seen him look at you, which has been frequently this morning. So whatever you have done, keep doing it." Olive said, "I have not done anything particular." Marian said, "You've been present and you've been yourself, and apparently that's exactly the particular thing he needed. Take the compliment." Olive took the compliment. Samuel and Henry stood beside their father during the ceremony, Samuel solemn and straight and proud, Henry wearing his good shirt and his good pants, and the expression of someone who has orchestrated something complicated and is watching it come together according to plan. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Chester kissed Olive for the first time as her husband, Henry said, loudly enough to be heard by the entire assembled congregation, "I told you she should stay forever." There was laughter. Even Chester laughed. The reception was on the ranch, with tables set up in the yard, and Rodrigo's wife Maria, who had come from Caldwell with Rodrigo for the occasion, cooked for approximately 7 hours straight and produced food that people would talk about for the rest of that year. There was dancing in the barn to the fiddle music of Pete Marsh, who turned out to be surprisingly gifted, and Olive danced with Chester, who was not a natural dancer but was a willing one, and she danced with Samuel, who was a very serious dancer, and she danced with Henry, who treated dancing as a full-contact sport. Late in the evening, when the lanterns had burned low and Henry was asleep in the corner on a horse blanket with his mouth open, and Samuel was sitting quietly beside him keeping watch the way he always kept watch over his younger brother, Chester found Olive standing at the barn door looking out at the Kansas night sky. He came to stand beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and neither of them needed to say anything for a while. "Are you happy?" he asked finally. "I'm the happiest I have ever been," she said, and she meant it with everything she had. "Good," he said. "Then we are even." He pressed his lips to her hair, and they stood together in the barn door while the fiddle music wound down behind them and the stars burned steady and clear over the Flint Hills, and she thought, "This is it. This is what I came for. Not the position, not the wages, not even the boys, though she loved those boys as surely as if she had brought them into the world herself. She had come for this man and this life, and this particular kind of solid, ordinary, extraordinary happiness. The first year of their marriage was the year Olive became Mrs. Barnett in all the ways that word can mean. She became the keeper of the house in a new and permanent way, not the careful, professional way of an employee, but the full, free way of a woman in her own home. She changed small things and left large things as they were, and she added to the house the gradual accumulation of a woman's presence, a quilt she had made through the winter, dried herbs hanging in the kitchen doorway, a row of seedlings in the windowsill in March, her daguerreotype of her mother on the parlor mantel, next to the daguerreotype of a leaner that had always been there. She asked Chester before she placed her mother's photograph on the mantel, because it seemed important to ask. He said without hesitation they should both be there, and so they were. She became Samuel's mother in the slow, earned way, each small trust offered and received, each confidence shared, each evening's homework completed side by side at the kitchen table. Samuel was a reader, she discovered, voracious and discerning, and she began driving to Caldwell once a month to visit the library that had opened in the fall of 1882. And she and Samuel each brought home 2 books and read them and traded and discussed them. And these conversations, conducted with the seriousness they both brought naturally to things that mattered, became one of the most beloved fixtures of her week. She became Henry's mother in a single afternoon in October. When Henry fell out of the cottonwood tree, he had been told repeatedly not to climb and broke his wrist, and she sat with him for 4 hours at Dr. Pratt's office in Caldwell, holding his hand through the setting of the bone and the splinting of it. And Henry, who had cried briefly and then decided crying was beneath him, spent most of those 4 hours talking to her about the many other things he intended to climb when the wrist healed. When they drove back to the ranch in the early evening, Henry fell asleep against her shoulder on the wagon seat, and she felt the weight of his small head and the warmth of him, and something large and permanent settled in her chest. A thing she recognized as the specific love that exists between a mother and a child, which is biological only in the least important of its aspects. She told Chester about this feeling that evening, after Henry was in bed and Samuel was reading, and they were alone in the kitchen in their established way. Chester listened, and when she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I know," in a voice that was so full of something she could not name that she had to look away for a second. "I just wanted you to know," she said, "that it's real, that they are mine in the way that matters." "I know it's real," he said. "I've watched it." He squeezed her hand once firmly. "They know it too. They know it even if they don't have words for it yet." The fall brought the cattle drive south with a portion of the herd, and Chester was gone for 3 weeks in November, which were the hardest 3 weeks of Olive's year. Not because she could not manage, she could and did, with Rodrigo's support and the Marsh brothers checking in daily, but because the house was wrong without Chester in it, too quiet in the specific way of a silence that is an absence rather than a peace. She wrote him 3 letters, knowing he would not receive them until he returned, but writing them anyway, and when he came back trail dusty and tired and carrying a small wrapped package he had found in a shop in Wichita, a thin volume of poetry she had mentioned months ago wanting to find. She understood that he had spent some portion of his weeks in that same particular missing. He handed her the book and she looked at it and then looked at him, and he said gruffly, "I thought about you every day," as if this was information she required and not a gift he was giving. "I thought about you every day too," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth briefly because the boys were there, and then Henry attached himself to Chester's legs like a limpet, and Samuel said, with dignified restraint, "I'm glad you're back, Pa," in a tone that conveyed considerably more than the words. That winter they read the poetry book aloud by the fire, sometimes all 4 of them, Chester reading in his deep, deliberate voice, and she thought there was no better sound in the world. In the spring of 1884, Olive discovered she was pregnant. She told Chester on a Thursday morning before breakfast, standing in the kitchen in the early light, and she had been planning to say it simply and practically, and she did say it simply, but the practically part evaporated when she saw his face. Chester Barnett, who felt very much and showed very little, looked at his wife in the thin March morning light, and his face went through something that had no composure in it at all. His eyes went bright, and he took one step and pulled her against him very carefully, as if she were something extraordinarily precious, and held her there without speaking. She wrapped her arms around him and felt him breathe. After a moment he said into her hair, "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "I'm very happy." He pulled back enough to look at her face, studying it in the way he had the careful reading of her. "You are very happy," he confirmed. "Good." He smiled fully, without reservation. "We are going to need a bigger kitchen table," she laughed. He kissed her, and the March sun came through the window and lay across the kitchen floor in a long gold strip, and she thought, This is what it is to be home. They told the boys at breakfast. Samuel received the information with the expression of someone who had been doing quiet calculations and had arrived at an expected result. He said, "I'll have to share my room eventually," and then, after a pause, "That will be all right." Henry said, "Can we name it Horse?" Chester said, "We are not naming it Horse." Henry said, "I think we should at least discuss it." The summer was hot, and the pregnancy progressed well, and Olive continued doing all the things she always did, at a slightly modified pace, which Chester monitored with a care that was occasionally excessive and always endearing. He would not let her carry anything heavier than a milk pail, which she argued with and eventually accepted, because arguing with Chester Barnett when he had decided something was the right thing to do was an exercise in very lovable futility. Rodrigo's wife, Maria, came to stay at the ranch for the last month, because Maria had delivered 4 children of her own, and because Chester trusted her completely, and her presence was a comfort to everyone, Maria being the kind of woman who made a house feel safer simply by being in it. The baby came in October, a night delivery that was long and difficult, and that Chester spent pacing the length of the porch 47 times, because Maria had very firmly put him out of the room. He came in when it was over, face pale, with the particular pallor of a man who has been very frightened for several hours, and is trying not to show how frightened he has been. Olive was exhausted and entirely triumphant. The baby was a boy. 8 pounds, dark-haired, with Chester's gray-green eyes already squinting at the lamplight, with an expression of profound skepticism. "He looks like you," Olive told Chester, who was holding the baby with the careful intensity of a man holding something he cannot believe is real. "He looks annoyed," Chester said. "He will grow out of that," Olive said. "He might," Chester said, "or he might take after his brothers." They named the baby James, which Chester had wanted after his father. Olive thought it was exactly right. James Chester Barnett, and he was from the very beginning the most demanding and opinionated baby she had ever encountered, and she adored him completely. Henry, for his part, accepted the name James under protest, but immediately began calling the baby Jamie, and then, within a week, had dropped any other form of address entirely, and would look blankly at anyone who used the full name. Samuel held the baby with the same solemnity with which he did everything important, and he looked at James for a long time, and then he looked at Olive and said, "He's ours," in a tone that was a statement and also a confirmation and also a kind of wonder. "He's ours," Olive agreed. Chester was at her side that evening when the house had quieted and the baby was sleeping and the boys were in bed, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son with an expression that she thought she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For all of it," he said. "For coming here, for staying, for all of the in-between." She reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for the advertisement," she said. He looked at her. "The advertisement," he said, with the slight, wondering tone of a man doing the arithmetic of consequence. "A piece of paper on a post office board in January. The whole rest of everything." 12 miles east of town," she said. 12 miles east of town," he agreed, and he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and they were quiet together in the lamplight while James slept, and the Kansas wind moved through the cottonwoods outside, and the house was full of the particular sound of a family. James grew, and the ranch grew, and the years settled into them like good soil being added each season to a field that was already productive, deepening and enriching what was already there. Chester expanded the ranch in 1885, purchasing a neighboring section of land that the Holler family had sold when Vince Holler, his old antagonist, had finally run through his resources and moved south. Chester bought the land without triumph, because he was not a man given to triumph over another man's failures, but he did stand at the fence line of the new property on the first morning of ownership and survey it with a deep and satisfied quiet, and Olive stood beside him and put her hand through his arm and understood the feeling. Rodrigo, in that same year, married a widow named Clara from Caldwell, and the wedding was a celebration at the Barnett Ranch to which the entire county seemed to come, and Rodrigo danced with such enthusiasm and joy that Henry, who was 8 by then and had opinions about most things, declared Rodrigo's dancing to be the finest he had ever witnessed, which Rodrigo accepted as the highest possible compliment. Samuel, at 11, had become such a reader and student that the school teacher in Caldwell, a young man named Mr. Webb, who had come from Ohio and was the best teacher the town had managed to hire, told Chester in the spring of 1886 that Samuel should be considered for further education, perhaps at one of the colleges in the East. Chester heard this and came home and told Olive, and they sat with it together for several evenings, turning it over. "He should go," Olive said on the third evening. Chester looked at her. "If he has the ability and the desire," she said, "then he should go. That's what an education is for. You give a child roots and then you let them have wings." She paused. "He has excellent roots," Chester said after a moment. "He does." And then, with the full weight of what he meant, "Because of you." "Because of us," she said. Chester nodded once, which was his way of accepting something deeply. The conversation with Samuel happened at the kitchen table, which was where all the most important conversations happened, and Samuel listened to everything and thought about it for 3 days, and came back and said, with characteristic precision, that he would like to continue his schooling, but that he did not want to go east for several years yet. And could he continue here until he was ready? And Chester said yes. And that was settled in the way that Samuel always settled things, thoroughly and without unnecessary drama. Henry, at 9, went through a period of wanting to be a doctor, then a railroad engineer, then a famous outlaw, which Chester addressed with remarkable patience, and then a veterinarian, which everyone agreed was the most plausible because of his affinity with the animals. He could get any horse on the ranch to cooperate with him by talking to it for 5 minutes in a low, confidential tone that suggested he was sharing state secrets, and the dogs followed him everywhere. Jamie learned to walk in the spring of 1885 and spent the first several weeks of his mobility getting into absolutely everything, inheriting in full measure the exploratory disposition that had characterized his oldest living brother at the same age. Chester observed this with an expression of resigned recognition. "Another one," Chester said to Olive one evening, watching Jamie methodically remove everything from the lowest kitchen shelf and examine each object with intense suspicion. "He is absolutely Henry's brother," Olive agreed. "We should probably move things," Chester said. "We should absolutely move things," Olive said. They moved things, and Jamie found different things to investigate, and the kitchen was never quite the same. In 1887, Olive found she was expecting again, which she told Chester with somewhat more confidence than the first time, because she was 29 and had survived one delivery well, and because she knew this house and this man and this life, and confidence was what she had now instead of the careful, professional composure of a hired woman. Chester's reaction was, if anything, warmer than the first time, because he was a man who had learned, over these years, to let himself feel what he felt without quite so much management. He said "good" with such complete conviction, such simple wholeness of gladness, that she kissed him in the middle of the morning with the kitchen door open and Rodrigo somewhere nearby, and she heard Rodrigo make a tactful sound and retreat, and she did not care at all. This baby came in November, a girl, which caught Chester somewhat off guard because he had expected, he admitted, another boy. "A girl," he said, holding her in the lamplight with the same careful wonder he had brought to every child he had ever held. "A girl," Olive confirmed. She watched his face. "Are you disappointed?" "I am the furthest possible thing from disappointed," he said. He looked up from the baby to Olive with an expression so straightforward and full it stopped her breath. "She looks like you. She has your eyes," Olive said. "Then she has the best of both of us," he said. They named her Alina Rose Barnett. Chester's face when Olive suggested Alina was something she would never forget, the way a person looks when they are given a gift they did not ask for and did not know they needed. "Alina," he said. "If you'd rather not," Olive said. "No," he said very quietly. "It's exactly right." He looked at the baby. "She'd be pleased," he said, meaning the first Alina. And Olive took this as the truth because she had come to know the woman through her children and her husband and the house she had built, and she believed she understood enough to know that Alina would have approved, would have been glad, would have recognized in Olive the good care of everything she had left behind. Alina Rose proved to be the most even-tempered of the Barnett children, which surprised no one more than Henry, who had fully expected a girl to be a catastrophe of some kind, and found himself instead enchanted by a placid, bright-eyed infant who watched everything with a serene intelligence that reminded Olive, privately, of Samuel. Henry recovered from his enchantment by deciding he was going to be her primary protector, which was an office he took up with such commitment that Samuel told him. After the third time, Henry had organized some preventive measure against a hypothetical danger, that Alina was fine and not in need of a personal guard. "She might need one when she's older," Henry said with complete seriousness. Samuel considered this. "True," he allowed. Chester overheard this exchange and told Olive about it at bedtime, and they both laughed softly in the dark, the kind of laughing that is also a form of gratitude. It was in the spring of 1889 that Samuel, now 13, came to Olive alone and asked her something he had clearly been holding for some time. He said carefully and formally, the way he said everything important, "I want to know if you love us. Not as a job, not as the reason you're here, actually." She looked at this serious, careful boy who had shaken her hand in the January yard 7 years ago as if recognizing the importance of the moment, and she said, without any hesitation at all, "I love you as much as it is possible to love anyone. You and Henry and Jamie and Alina. You are mine and I am yours, and that has been true since before I understood that it was true. Does that answer your question?" Samuel looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I just needed to hear it said plainly." "I should say it more plainly more often," she said. "You say it in other ways," he said, which was such an adult thing to say that she had to look away for a moment. She told Chester about this conversation that evening, sitting on the porch in the May warmth, and Chester was quiet for a long time. "He's a good boy," Chester said finally. "He is a good person," Olive said, "and he is going to be a remarkable one." Chester looked at her with the particular look she had named, years ago, as the one that meant he was feeling something he wanted her to know about without having the words organized yet. "The best thing I have ever done," he said slowly, "other than loving Alina, was putting that advertisement on the post office board." "Gerald Finch told me you were a respectable man," she said. Gerald Finch was correct, Chester said, and the absolute lack of self-consciousness with which he said it made her laugh. "He was absolutely correct," she said, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the May evening, and he put his arm around her, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the Flint Hills rolled away to the horizon, and the cottonwoods moved in the gentle spring wind. 12 miles east of town," she said softly, thinking of the advertisement and the frozen January morning and the carpetbag with 42 cents in her pocket. 12 miles east of town," he said. "Best 12 miles in Kansas." By the end of 1889, the Barnett Ranch was one of the most prosperous operations in Sumner County. Chester had added another section of land, increased the herd significantly, and had hired 2 additional ranch hands to help Rodrigo, who at 51 showed no signs of slowing down but whose knees, he admitted to Olive privately, had opinions about cold mornings. Chester had also built an addition to the house, 2 new rooms on the east side, which gave everyone more space and gave Olive a room she designated as a study, where she kept her books and her writing desk and the letters from her brothers, both of whom had married and one of whom, Thomas, had written to say he might come west, and could Chester possibly use a man who knew horses. Chester's reply to Thomas Wallace was characteristically brief and warm, which was to say 2 sentences of practical information and 1 sentence of genuine welcome. And Thomas arrived in September of 1889 and proved to be very good with horses indeed, and was immediately at home among the Barnett hands and more importantly among the Barnett family, Henry and Jamie adopting him with the enthusiasm of boys who have discovered an uncle. Thomas, on his 3rd evening at the ranch, sat beside Olive at the supper table and looked around at the full, loud, warm scene of the kitchen, all the children and Chester and Rodrigo and Clara who had come to supper, and the food and the lamplight and the sound of Henry explaining something to Tommy at a volume appropriate to outdoor activities, and he said quietly to Olive, "You found it." "Found what?" she said. "The thing you always wanted," he said. "When we were small and you would make up the house and take care of us. The real version of it." She looked at him, and he looked back at her with the eyes of a younger brother who had watched his older sister manage everything alone for too many years, and was genuinely glad to see her not managing alone anymore. "I did find it," she said. Chester, on the other side of her, caught the word found and glanced at her, and she smiled at him, and he smiled back, and Thomas watched this exchange with the expression of a man who understands, belatedly, what it means for 2 people to have a language with each other. Christmas of 1889 was the best Christmas in the memory of anyone present, which included Thomas, Rodrigo and Clara, Pete Marsh, who had no family left, and the entire Barnett family, including Alina Rose, who was 2, and had very strong opinions about wrapping paper as a substance. Henry had organized a system for the gift distribution, which was logistically complex and entirely unnecessary, and which Chester observed with the contained amusement of a man watching someone rediscover something eternal. Samuel read aloud from a book of Christmas stories after supper while everyone gathered around the fire, his voice steady and warm. And Olive sat with Alina Rose in her lap and Jamie against her knee and Chester's hand in hers, and she thought, I am the luckiest woman in Kansas. I am possibly the luckiest woman alive. She thought about January 1882 and the advertisement on the post office board and the careful, practical letter she had written and the reply in the firm, angular hand. She thought about stepping off the wagon into the cold January yard and looking up at a man she had never met who was watching her with those gray-green eyes, bracing himself for something he could not predict. She thought about chess by firelight and apple butter in the kitchen, and curtains cut to match her Sunday dress and a broken lamp in a box and two boys shaking her hand. And she thought about all the ways that a life can change direction entirely, not always dramatically, but sometimes simply and powerfully, through a piece of paper and a brave decision and a man who meant everything he said. She squeezed Chester's hand. He turned to look at her, and the firelight was in his eyes and the children were around them and the house was full of everything a house should be full of, and he looked at her with the look that she had named and known and loved for years, the one that was full to the edges of everything he felt. She thought about the advertisement: room, board, and fair wages. A capable woman of good character. She thought about what she had actually found. She thought about what he had actually meant. The boys need a mother. And I need more. She had thought she understood that advertisement. She had thought it was a practical transaction, a need and a capability, matched on paper and exchanged for wages. She had been with the best possible outcome completely wrong. What are you thinking? Chester asked her quietly under the sound of Samuel's reading and the fire and Henry's running commentary on the story at a pitch he believed to be a whisper. I am thinking that Gerald Finch was exactly right about you, she said. Chester considered this. Respectable, he said. Respectable, she confirmed, and considerably more. He lifted her hand and kissed it, and Alina Rose looked up from the wrapping paper she had been systematically destroying and decided this was interesting and reached up to pat his face with her small hand. And Chester allowed his cheek to be patted with complete dignity, and Henry said, She does that to me too. It means she likes you. And Samuel paused in his reading long enough to say, Henry, and continued. And Jamie made a bid for the wrapping paper that Alina foiled with the confidence of someone who has learned to guard resources. And the fire crackled, and the December wind was outside, and the house was warm and full and whole. Outside, the Kansas prairie lay quiet under a clear winter sky, the Flint Hills rolling to the horizon the way they had always rolled, indifferent to the stories of the people who built their lives at their feet. 12 miles east of Caldwell, the Barnett Ranch was a constellation of lamplight in the darkness, the house and the barn and the bunkhouse making their small, warm claim against the vast and ancient dark. Inside that light, Olive Barnett sat with her family and felt, in every part of her, the complete and solid happiness of a woman who had walked toward an uncertain door in the cold morning of an uncertain life, and had found, on the other side of it, everything. Chester turned from the children and looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and she looked back at him and understood this and was glad of it. The fire burned, and Samuel read, and the children were loud and warm and hers, and outside the Kansas stars were the same stars that had burned over the territory for 10,000 years before Chester Barnett drove his cattle north up the Kisham Trail and looked at a piece of land in Sumner County and decided it was worth building something on, worth staying for, which it was, which everything was, which Olive Wallace, now Olive Barnett, 12 miles east of Caldwell, Kansas, in the warm and final certainty of the last years of the old century, knew with every part of herself to be absolutely, irrevocably, and forever true.